There we are. Okay. Good to see you all on our last week. Please remember we have a quiz this week, so try to get it done by the end of the week. And also, you should be getting a link to the student evaluations in the next few days or something. So, hey, Ms. Moses. So please do them. In the old days, they used to have you do them on paper in class. And then someone would take them to the registrar or whatever. And they stopped doing that years ago. I think they decided that doing it online was easier and more efficient. But all it had the effect was like nobody does them anymore. Like if 40% of the people in the class do it, that's a good evaluation. And usually it's the people who hate you who do it. Because hate is a strong emotion. You're angry. You're like, this class sucked. Which is fine. If you hated the class, do the evaluation. But I'd also want to hear from a broader spectrum of people who are like in the middle, and people who liked it, so I can get an idea of what I did right, what I did wrong. So please do the evaluations or take some time to do them. And I think that's it. I think that's the only thing. If you didn't do paper number 2, please hand it in as soon as possible. Ms. I'll talk to you after class, Ms. Purnell, because I don't want to say anything. Yeah, because it will be marked late, but you should still be able to submit it and get it in and get some points for it. And the extra credit. Maybe you saw my email. There's an extra credit quiz. You watch a video on YouTube, which is in the under the modules. If you scroll down, I have a link to the video. It's on setting up an altar. It's from the viewpoint of Tibetan Buddhism of how to set up an altar in your home or wherever. It's only about 21 minutes. I should say only, if you're stuck for time, then. But it's 21 minutes about, thereabouts. And you watch that, and then there are a series of questions in the quiz that you can take. You don't have to take it. It's extra to you, so it doesn't hurt you if you don't take it. It's added on extra 5% to your grade. So it might help some people a little bit get closer. God bless you, if you need to get closer to a better grade. So, anywho, Buddhism. What are we talking about today? The Sangha. God bless you again. I might come back to that. And again. Yeah, I remember I had something on this PowerPoint that I wanted to read from. Where was it? There it is. Is this it? Yeah, this is it. It was about karma. Bless you. And unfortunately, I didn't have my right PowerPoint. But this is it. This is what I wanted to show you about karma. So I wanted to just read it. It's from a work called the Milinda Panha, or the dialogue of. I think it's called the Dialogue of Milinda. I think is the title. Should have written the title down. Oh wait, maybe I have it in my notes. Oh, sorry. The Questions of King Milinda it's its title in English. The Milinda Panha, The Questions of King Milinda, written sometime between 100 BC and 200 AD. So there's a wide range when it was written, and it's a dialogue. It's a. You find this in a lot of cultures where they have that's what Socrates did. Plato wrote dialogues with the philosopher Socrates asking questions and answering questions, and you have this in religious literature as well. You have Christian literature where you have like a dialogue between Christians and Jews or Christians and non-Christians trying to convince the reader to become a Christian. And in this case, this is Buddhist religious literature of the same kind of variety or genre where you have this dialogue between a man named Milinda and a Buddhist teacher. And Milinda asks questions. Milinda's a non-Buddhist, and he asks questions, and the Buddhist teacher gives answers, and eventually Milinda decides that he accepts the teaching of Buddhism. So it's a dialogue between this Buddhist monk and a ruler who's troubled over life, and eventually Milinda becomes a bhikshu. He enters the Sangha. What's interesting about this work is that it may have some historical background to it. Not that it actually happened, probably didn't, but that Milinda seems to be a corruption of a European name of Menander, this Greek name Menander. who seems to have been an actual historical figure. He was what they call an Indo-Greek. He was, as I said, the Greek culture had spread almost to northern India, and you had Greek kingdoms in Afghanistan and Pakistan, those regions. And he was the ruler of that region, like in the region of Pakistan and whatever. This guy Menander, I think it was Menander II. So we do know a person from history, and this seems to be a corruption of his name as Melinda. And he may have become a Buddhist. It's possible that he did actually become a Buddhist because during his reign, there is Buddhist statuary and stuff like that during his reign. So anyway, there might be an historical grain of truth in this, of this Greek ethnically, well, I should say culturally Greek, we don't know his ethnicity actually, but culturally Greek European who was a local ruler who did become a Buddhist, and he's used as a character in this conversation. Anyway, so this is what goes on. The king said, meaning Melinda, why is it Nagasena? Or does anyone want to read this, actually? Does anyone want to read from the Melinda? Oh, go ahead, Miss Buttercup. Thank you.
Why is it Nagasena that all men are not alike? Some are short-lived and some are long-lived. Some sick and some healthy. Some ugly and some beautiful. Some without influence and some of great power. Some poor and some wealthy. Some low-born and some high-born. Some stupid and some wise. The elder replied, why is it that all vegetables are not alike, but some sour, and some salt, and some pungent, and some acid, some astringent, and some sweet? I fancy, sir, it is because they come from different kinds of seeds. And just so, great king, are the differences you have mentioned among men to be explained. For it has been said by the Blessed One, beings have each their own karma, are inheritors of karma, belong to the tribe of their karma, are relatives by karma, have each their karma as their protecting overlord. It is karma that divides them up into low and high and the like divisions.
Sorry. Very good, Nugget. Sorry about that. Very good, Ms. Undercup. Yes. So this is from Melinda Panha, book 3. And yeah, so I just wanted to read it because it deals with the question of karma. And Nagasena, the Buddhist teacher, compares it to a seed. Karma is like the seed that you plant for your future life. Hopefully you plant no seed because you don't want to be reborn. But he's asking, why are men so different? And women as well. Why some are tall and short and stupid and smart and not really politically correct, but what's going on? And like I say, these are the seeds that you planted in your previous life. The various good seeds or bad seeds, which affect, how you're supposed to be. These dualities, I guess. One's supposed to be good and one's supposed to be bad. I'm not sure if being short is necessarily a bad thing, or being tall is necessarily a bad thing. You could be very tall and it could be very bad for you. Like one of those giants, you see in the against world records or something, believe it or not, because you get all sorts of health problems. Then the person could be very short, and that could be a good thing for them. I don't know if it's necessarily good or bad. But anyways, the karma, your good or bad karma, determines these characteristics of the person. Remember, it's the karmic effects. It's not really the person. It's the seeds that the person has sown that are going through the different lives. Okay, and that's what you see. All right, so if you see, let's say, I'm not saying being short is a bad thing, but let's say that, or let's say a person who's sick all the time. They have a lot of illnesses. These would seem to be negative. Why is that? You're not really seeing a person who's sick. You're seeing the sickness, which is a result of the bad karma the person merited or built up in the previous existence. So we inherit our karma. It's our tribe. It's our overlord. Quoting the Blessed One is another saying to Buddha. The Buddha is also called the Blessed One. Okay, so these are why there are differences, the karmic effects. I think this is a similar, almost the same, I guess, as in Hinduism when we talked about karma in Hinduism. Karma determined which caste you would be born into and stuff like that. So, but, it really does affect, it attaches itself. The thing about karma is that it attaches itself to the Atman. But for Buddha, there is no Atman for it to attach itself. So you're not seeing itself actually. You're seeing, when I look out at all of you, I'm seeing the results of your karma. And I look at your grades, and I really see the results of your No, your grades are fine. Yes, Ms. Purnell.
This is unrelated, but
go ahead.
For quiz 5, what
is the topic, or like Islam?
Yes, I think it's all on Buddhism. I think. Trying to think. Just give me a second here. Reach back. There might be some Islam in it. I think there's some Islam. So I think there's the end of Islam and then Buddhism.
Okay.
Okay. You're welcome. All right. So moving on to this this segues into the Sangha because Melinda, aka Menander, enters into the community. He converts to Buddhism. He sees the wisdom of it. And so we now talk about the Sangha, which in English, the word Sangha simply seems to mean an assembly, a collection of people. Nothing big, mystifying about it. The Sangha. As you know, there are around 495 million Buddhists in the world, but it's difficult to estimate the total number of Buddhists because you have because of the religious conditions in places like China, Tibet, and Mongolia, where a lot of Buddhists are. I think almost half of Buddhists reside in the country of China. But Tibet, which wants to be its own country, has its own culture, but it was invaded by China, I think, in the 50s. But so there's a lot of, from the Tibetan perspective, oppression. So you don't know how many people what's really going on in Tibet because the Chinese government is very restrictive about information. They're very sensitive about it. Mongolia is its own country now, but it's still developing country. It's still kind of a new country, so it might not be possible to always get accurate figures. And, officially China is an atheist state, or at least it tends towards an atheistic viewpoint, so they're not particularly interested in, religion. They want to keep control over religion, exert control over the religious groups, but they're not that concerned, Ms. Reeser, about maybe head counting. So, what am I going to do with you? All right. And it's also difficult because Buddhism has been amalgamated into the local culture in some areas. It's like Japan, where a person might say he or she is Buddhist, but really doesn't practice anything, but that's what they identify. And you see this with other religions as well. A person, who's Irish might just say in a knee-jerk fashion, I'm Catholic, I celebrate St. Patrick's Day, might go to church during Christmas and Easter, but do you pray? Do you believe the beliefs? If they know the beliefs, maybe not. They maybe don't practice, but I'm Irish, and that's what we're supposed to be, right? Or Italian, that's what we're supposed to be. You're supposed to believe in the Pope, because he's still the Pope. Even if you're not Christian, you still might be proud of the Pope because it's Italy, even though he's not Italian. But ideally, the Pope should be Italian if you're Italian. Always. Anyways, so the Sangha. So we have an idea of we have an estimate of how many Buddhists there are in the world. I think I was looking at the internet the other day, and it said there was maybe, the number could be different. So you might see different numbers on the internet, and that might explain why there are different head counts of how many Buddhists there are. But this seems to be, at least according to the book that I used, how many there are. Now, there are two main branches. Some would say three, but there are two main branches historically of the Sangha. There are divisions. And those two main branches are called the Theravada and the Mahayana. Theravada comes from, I believe it's Pali language, which means the teaching of the elders. Teaching of the elders. Thera comes from Sanskrit stavira, which means an elder, someone who's an older person. Stavira, means an older person. And a vada is a teaching, literally it's speech. It means speech or talking. So you could say it's the talk or the speech. You could say it's literally the talking of the older guys, the elders. But we'll go with teaching of the elders. Theravada. And Mahayana means the great vehicle. Maha means great in Sanskrit, and Ayana is a vehicle, something that conveys you, takes you somewhere. So these are the two great divisions of Buddhism. As you can see from the map and the world map at the beginning of the PowerPoint, Buddhism is largely confined to Eastern and Southeastern Asia. As I already told you, like half of Buddhists reside in China, the one country of China. And after that, it would be Thailand and Cambodia. Thailand and then Cambodia right next to it, where you have the majority of the rest of the Buddhists. And these two groups are in different colors. Mahayana is blue, Theravada is red. And they're about a 60-40 split. 60% belong to the Mahayana variety and 40% belong to the Theravada. Let's see where they mostly are. China has like 240 some million, and they're mostly Mahayanists. See Nepal, Bhutan. Bhutan, this little country of Bhutan, it's a mountainous country. It's fascinating. It's the only Buddhist majority, or Buddhism is the official religion. Tibetan Buddhism is the official religion of Bhutan. Until maybe 20 years ago, it was a very enclosed, closed-off country to the rest of the world. It was hard to get in there, but they've opened up and they introduced internet and stuff like that. But yeah, it was very interesting. It was very, just watching videos of it and seeing, the boys going to the monastery every day. And now, of course, they're in the internet cafes playing all these shooter games. So not violate one of the Sheilas, like don't harm another people. But I guess they aren't harm another living being, but they're doing it virtually, so whatever. But that's the mistake. I mean, once you set up like televisions and stuff like that, that's the death of religious life. Because no one wants to go chant mantras in the monastery when they could be like blowing zombies' heads apart. And they're little boys. The video game people know what they want. So, anyways, they're trying to. In Bhutan, they're trying to be open, but not so open that they lose their culture. Let's see how that works. Anyway, so Bhutan, Mahayana, Korea, the Koreas, and Japan, Vietnam, and Theravada is in Sri Lanka and Burma, and Thailand, and Laos. This is Laos, and that's Cambodia. So that's what mainly Theravada variety is. Anyways, where do they come from? They come from two early groups. After the Buddha died, or passed into nirvana, in the parinirvana, went to sleep into nirvana, wafted away, there were divisions in Buddhism about how to interpret his teachings. There were questions about how to interpret his teachings, and you had a lot of schools develop. They're called schools, but groups with different interpretations develop, a lot of them. And there were two main groups, or conglomerations of these groups of schools. And one of them was the Theravadins, is their ancient name. Theravadins. Vadins, that's a V. Who eventually, out of this larger group, Theravada emerges. It's not exactly the same, but it emerges out of this tradition. And then you have what was called the Great Sangha, or the Great Assembly, the Mahasanghika. Which again was a larger group of people. Out of which eventually emerged what is generally called the Great Vehicle, or Mahayana Buddhism. But just so you know that their connections are, it's like they're survivors of these two great groups of early Buddhist schools. And they split apart. And the cause for the split is uncertain. It's not entirely clear. There are a couple of theories. And it seems to go back, we can kind of see a reason why in the early Buddhist councils, which I mentioned before, but I'll come back to. Remember, we had three early Buddhist councils that I talked about: Rajagriha, Vaishali, and Pataliputri. Putra, excuse me. Okay. Yeah, so there were arguments. I mean, there were arguments almost as soon as the Buddha died about what his teaching meant. And this period, you have what are sometimes called the 18 schools of Buddhism. So there were a lot of different schools and interpretations. There was a big fracturing in the interpretation. And according to tradition, there were these three important councils which helped establish what Buddhism should be. Okay, but it also kind of tore the community apart and showed the cracks in the community. And eventually these disagreements were not tolerable anymore, and you had the separation of groups from each other. So, I mean, I think I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again, that, regarding the dates of these councils, whether they actually happened, there might be some historical truth to it. Whether it's accurate or not is another question. So they might be reliable that there were these meetings, but the details are kind of all over the place in the sources. So scholars are not think maybe something happened like these councils, but we can't really rely on them for historical accuracy. You have to sift through the details. Nevertheless, the first council of Rajagriha was held a few months after the Buddha's death, and that was to establish the teachings. I mentioned this during the scripture. This is where the Tipitaka began to be organized. Okay, the Buddha was a preacher, not a writer, so his disciples had memorized his teachings. So they came together to say, this is what I remember, and that's what I remember, and that's what I remember, and they brought it all together, and they found out that miraculously, there was really no disagreement about the teachings. Apparently, I guess they were all saying exactly the same thing, singing from the same song sheet, as they say. So they were able to establish at least part of the canon. Scholars think that at Rajagriha they established the the Vinaya Pitaka, so the rules relating to the community and the organization of the order, and the Sutta Pitaka, which was the collection of the Buddha's discourses and sermons. So at least the Vinaya and the Sutta seem to have been established at the Council of Rajagriha, those two baskets. So presumably the Abhidhamma came later, sometime. The Council of Vaishali addressed concerns about lax practices amongst the bhikshus, so accepting money. There was a group that said that handling money, and they also listed 9 other practices that they thought were legitimate for bhikshus, for monks to perform. But another group, the more orthodox, you might say, the more correct believing, I guess, since they're the winners of the argument, said that no, these were illegal, like handling money and stuff like that. You shouldn't do those things. And the council sided with that group. But so we start to see that there is kind of this division that's arising. There are monks that are maybe more progressive or allowing, following different interpretations, but there's another group that wants to kind of stay the line and follow things more strictly, have more maybe rigidity. So how is this resolved? So we start seeing maybe the cracks at Vaishali. There's no, how is it resolved? We don't know exactly, but some accounts of the council say that the so-called lax monks, who may have not been lax at all, they might have just not as rigid about certain rules, or had different rules, but they held their own council. So they didn't accept the decision of the Council of Vaishali, the majority. They decided to hold their own meeting, in which they then established themselves as the Mahasanghika, the Great Assembly. And so we're the ones who are truly following the will of the Buddha. But so there already seems to be a schism or a cutting apart of the group. Then we come to Pataliputra. That's why I say troubles a brewing at Vaishali. But then we say Pataliputra, which is around 253. Somewhere I read that it was 250, but whatever. It's around 253. The dates are all over the place in the sources. So about how many years it was held after the Buddha reached nirvana. See, that's how they date things. They say so 100 years after nirvana. Meaning the Buddha reached nirvana. This council was held. So. Some sources say 100, some say 116, some say that, so this is the general accepted date among scholars, 253. And it was at Pataliputra that this great schism, the Sanghabheda, happened, formalized. It was already happening, and some scholars argue that it actually did happen at Vaishali, but Pataliputra seems to have formalized this break between the elders, the group called the elders, the Staviras, and this group that was calling itself the Great Sangha, the Great Assembly, the Mahasanghika. So Pataliputra is the most crucial of these three readings. That's why I have an asterisk and I have it, in all capital. According to the traditional story, it was held under the Buddhist emperor Ashoka, whom I've mentioned before, who was an emperor, had an empire across northern India at this time. One comes back, one goes. It's like dependent arising. One leaves, one comes back. One ceases to be, one comes into existence. Anyways, I got to make my own fun. Again, that's the traditional story that it happened under the Emperor Ashoka. So I'll go with that, but, who knows? I wasn't there. And according to the story, 1,000 monks came together for 9 months to check, complete, and classify the oral traditions. Did it really happen? Again, we don't know for sure, but maybe there was something that happened. But it is known as the place and the time when there was finally this break where the two groups could not coexist anymore and they kind of went their separate ways. Before that, there seemed to be, pretty much a unity in the Sangha. I mean, the different schools of Buddhism seem to exist or coexist, even though they disagreed on elements of the Buddha's teaching. But they would stay in the same monasteries, and go to the same lectures by the same teachers and stuff. And there didn't seem to be any great, dissension, not dissension, but there didn't seem to be any animosity, But then it develops, I guess. Maybe not so much animosity, but as a dislike between the two groups, one, as we'll see. Why did this happen? I mean, according to the scholarly opinion, there are two opinions. There's, a couple of monks having a little tete-a-tete. That's not good. That's generating some bad karma. I guess the one guy will come back as a chicken in the next life, But there's a scholarly opinion, and then there's the traditional view of what happened or what caused this split. The sources clearly identify Pataliputra as the source of the schism, even though a lot of Buddhist scholars today would say that actually probably Vaishali was when it happened. But why is this? Because the reason for the schism is said to have been over the Vinaya rules, the Vinaya Pitaka, which contains the rules of the order and stuff like that. It wasn't a doctrinal thing, which is what the later explanation was, that it was about doctrine. They disagreed over the Buddha's doctrine. Or not the Buddha's doctrine, but doctrinal questions. But there seems to be an early memory that really it was more about the rules and how to live the Buddhist life. And this, God bless you, this was the issue at Vaishali. Remember, with the lax monks versus the non-lax, these 9 practices. I know one of them was handling money. I don't know. Don't ask me what the other ones were. I'd have to look it up. But anyways, these practices of the monks, yes, the Vinaya, that were illicit or illegitimate versus those that were these practices legitimate or not? So that's the question. So that's why scholars seem to pinpoint it with Vaishali, because that seems to be the earliest memory of what the problem was. It was a problem about living the life and not about, say, more abstract ideas of doctrine. What was the conflict in the scholarly view? As I said, it was over rules, the Vinaya rules. A smaller group, the Staviras, the elders, wanted to add more rules to the Vinaya. And the larger group, the Mahasangikas, objected to that. What it seems to have been was that there were things that monks did customarily, but they weren't rules per se. And it seems like the elders, the group of the elders, the Staviravadins, wanted to formalize these rules and make them an official part of the Vinaya Pitaka that you had to follow if you were a monk. And the Mahasangikas, which are really kind of a more progressive group, but in this case they were more conservative, were saying, no, these things are customs, they're traditions, they're not things you have to do. You can do them, but you don't have to. You're trying to make them into obligations, and you shouldn't be doing that. And that was the source of their divergence or their disagreement. That was their dispute. And this seems to be borne up by the evidence, because if you look at the scriptures, the difference between the Theravadin writings, the Theravadin version of the Vinaya Pitaka, and the Mahayana version of the Pitaka, the Vinaya Pitaka, in the rules for monks, the Vinaya is longer, has more rules for the Theravadas than for the Mahayana. So the Mahayana version, scholars think, is the older of the two, actually, and it's shorter. It doesn't have all these rules that they seem to be added on rules. So it seems to, even in the scriptures, it seems to the versions of the scriptures that are used by these two groups or brands of Buddhism, seems to be some evidence for this argument that it was a question over the rules of the community and not so much doctrine. The Buddha said that these rules, certain rules, were minor rules and could be ignored, these customary rules. They weren't obligations necessarily, but the Staviras the elders wanted to revive them. So this is just a quote from a book from Andrew Skilton, Concise History of Buddhism. I thought this was an interesting. Andrew Skilton. Concise History of Buddhism, published in 1998, was it? 1994, excuse me. He says, quote, far from representing the falling away from original discipline and purity by lax Mahasangika monks, the dispute really involved the attempted addition of rules to the Vinaya by a minority group who were preoccupied by the letter rather than the spirit of the Buddha's injunctions. So rather than being lax monks, the members of the Mahasanghika wanted to live by the old original Vinaya, but a smaller group of the senior members, they were older monks who were older or had been in the community longer, so they were Staviras. They wanted to add on all sorts of rules and obligations to the Vinaya, to develop it more, make them into obligatory laws. Now that's the scholarly view of why there was a split. Rules. So just remember that. That's the scholarly view. The traditional view says it was about doctrine. This is the older view. The earlier view seems to be rules, but then doctrinal disputes that develop later on, they become the reason why. And this is the traditional view. And it was according to what you'll hear from most Buddhists, the split between Theravada and Mahayana occurred because of the question of the status of the Arhat. The Arhat. God bless you. The Arhat is basically, I guess what you could say is the holy man in Buddhism. It's the fully enlightened person. They told you before that for Theravada Buddhists, at least, there can be no Buddha. There's only one Buddha for an age. And at least for our period of time, we've had our Buddha already. So the most that any Buddhist, good Buddhist, can hope for is to become a fully enlightened being, an arhat, okay? But not a Buddha. I can't reach that yet, all right? At least not in this time period. So, but there were questions about what was the status of an arhat, this kind of enlightened, this person who had reached enlightenment, who was kind of lower than a Buddha, but had reached enlightenment. Oh, Mr. Pratt, there you are. Hello, Mr. Pratt. Is Ms. Pennick here? I don't see Ms. Pennick. Mr. Bowski? Ms. Montiel, are you here? There you are. And according, it was this guy Mahadeva, this monk Mahadeva, presented 5 theses to the community about arhats that should be accepted or rejected. Okay, and this is the split according to the traditional view. All right. So, for example, what were his 5 theses? Well, one of his theses was that an arhat can still be led astray, can still be tempted. Okay, for example, by erotic dreams in the night and stuff like that. So that can still happen. Can still be moved by temptation. The second thesis was that an arhat is still subject to ignorance. In other words, in the sense that, an arhat might not know something, might not know a man's name, or, which road to take if he's traveling. He might not know the name of a particular tree. What's the name of that tree? Is it a birch? Is it a beech? Is it an oak? He might not know, So I think that's trying to explain the fact that they're still kind of human beings. You don't know everything. But an arhat, ideally, for Buddhism, once you reach enlightenment, you're omniscient. You know everything. But he's trying to say, well, no, that's not really the case. You can still be tempted. You still don't know everything. You can be ignorant of information. Arhat, you can still be subject to doubt, having doubts. You can also be informed by others. That's number 4, be informed by others. So you still need to be taught. Someone else can teach you and tell you how to do things. And then finally, this is a weird one. I'm not sure what to make of this. Entry into the path of Buddhism can be accompanied by a vocal utterance. So an arhat can kind of make the path towards liberation appear if he kind of shouts like, "Oh!" He says, "Oh, suffering!" And in the beginning of, by doing that, when he's meditating, it should open up immediately the pathway to liberation, so he can see the path he's supposed to follow. That's what I make of this 5th thesis. It's a weird one. I'm not sure I fully understand what his thing, but something about the arhat by shouting can open up the realm of enlightenment or open up the pathway to enlightenment. Now, this was the view that was taken by the Mahasanghika, the greater portion of the Buddhists. They said, Ms. Reeser, that yes, an arhat can still be ignorant, can still be subject to temptation, can still make progress in enlightenment. And so the Mahasanghika accepted these 5 points of the monk Mahadeva. For them, the fact that you weren't perfect kind of emphasized the need for the Buddha's compassion and supernatural help in reaching enlightenment. But for the Saviras, who will become the Theravadas later on, I guess the Theravadas will inherit the lineage of the Saviravadas, at least their ideas, said that no, the arhat was not any of these things. The arhat was no longer human in that type of way. So an arhat was not ignorant, would not doubt, would not be subject to temptation. One who has reached enlightenment already knows the path. So they rejected these 5 theses for the arhat. And according to the traditional view, that is the center of the schism. That basically a Buddha was higher up than an arhat. And the elders said, well, no, because you can't become a Buddha. So your personal goal is not to become a Buddha; it's to become an arhat. Whereas the Mahayana group, eventually what will be called the Mahayana group, said, well, no, arhathood is still good. It's still something you want to pursue, but ultimately we want to become Buddhas like the Buddha. So I guess in a way they're kind of rejecting that Theravada view that there can be no Buddhas in any one eon. You can't have more Buddhas. So, okay. So here's just a picture I drew where you have the picture of the Buddha, whatever he looked like. You have his dharma, his teaching and way of life. You have the conglomeration of groups that are generally called the Savirabhada, the Mahasanghika, and eventually these two main forms grow out of these larger groups. Theravada is the only surviving school to come out of the Savirabhada way. Actually, it should be teaching of the elders, not way. That's a mistake, so you might want to correct that. The great vehicle, is the larger of the two, and that includes a whole bunch of different ways of doing things. There's the general way of Mahayana, but Mahayana was, we'll talk about it in a moment. Mahayana was kind of also progressive, and it would integrate local beliefs into the larger Buddhist framework. So you had things like the Burn religion, which is the native religion of Tibet. Scholars think they have to kind of reconstruct it. Those are two dots over the Burn religion. You had Chinese Chan religion, which was focused on meditation. Chan means meditation in Chinese. You had sexual practices, and Tantrism. And then you had other native religions like Taoism, which was native to China, and Shinto, native to Japan. And these entered into and contributed and were reinterpreted in a Buddhist framework. So you get Tibetan Buddhism from the native Tibet religion, Zen from Chan, Vajrayana from Tantrism, Pure Land Buddhism, which develops in Japan. I should note that these are the two main groups, but also people will add Vajrayana as a third. But really, Vajrayana is a subgroup of Mahayana Buddhism. But it's so important because it's so associated, especially with Tibetan Buddhism, that you'll sometimes see it as the third separate group. But really, it's part of Mahayana. It's not really a third distinct group from Theravada and Mahayana. Okay. So what are these groups concerned with? Well, with Theravada, the concern is the arhat. The Theravadas share the concern of the Sthaviras for doctrinal purity and the preservation of the Buddha's teachings without innovation or alteration. Seems kind of weird because weren't they the ones who wanted to add all the rules, which might be, but then I guess the logic is that they weren't really adding rules. They were minor rules that they wanted to make obligatory, and they saw that maybe as protecting the Buddha's doctrine. They didn't want the Buddha's teachings, certain rules, to fall out of disuse. They wanted to preserve everything, all or nothing, I guess. And so that's in the way they're more conservative, whereas the Mahasanghikas were more progressive in the sense, more traditional in the sense that the Buddha said, well, some of these rules are not really that obligatory. You can ignore them if you need to. But they were more open to development in Buddhist understanding and teaching. Whereas the Theravadas wanted to keep things complete. So Theravada Buddhism, what we call Theravada Buddhism, appears formally in the 200s BC. The 200s as part of the larger conglomeration of the 18 schools of thought. So it was just one of many of these early Buddhist schools that has survived. And Theravada is the oldest surviving lineage of ancient Buddhism. As I showed you on the picture, it's mostly kind of centers in Sri Lanka, the island country of Sri Lanka at the southern tip of India, because that's where like the scriptures were written down and stuff like that, and then it kind of spread from Sri Lanka and India out to Southeast Asia. And so, the Theravadins are very defensive and protective of the Pali Canon. They accept the Pali Canon and that's it. They don't accept any additions to it. Whereas Mahayana, again, is in that sense more inclusive. It accepts the Pali Canon, yes, but Mahayana Buddhism adds a lot of other writings that add to and develop the teachings of the Buddha found in the Pali Canon, whereas the Theravadins are very much focused just on the Pali Canon, the Vinaya, the Sutta, and the Abhidhamma. Theravada is also very focused on monasticism, which really is the traditional way of Buddha's movement. Okay, it was not a movement for everybody. To enter into the Sangha, it wasn't like you became a disciple. You could be a follower of the Buddha, but to truly be a follower of the Buddha, you had to enter into the actual community, and it was like a monastic community. You lived together. You said your mantras together. I want to say prayers, but I guess you could say prayers as well. You just lived your whole life together. You went out begging together. Here the monks are out on their daily begging rounds for their food, and stuff like that. And you were invested in the robe of a monk. You shaved your head. Even if you were a woman, the nuns also shaved their heads. So it's a monastic movement. Not everyone could do this, okay? Which might be why the Mahasanghika or the Mahayana kind of grew more, or is maybe more popular than the Theravada, the more traditional view, okay? Because it's not it's a religion, yes, but it's more a way of life. It's not really a religion that embraces, where in Hinduism, yes, do they have asceticism in Hinduism? Yes, but that's meant for later in life, remember? But first you're a student, then you're a householder, you establish a family and a business, and then later in life you go out to the forest and you study the Vedas, and so that's part of it. But the Buddha cuts through all of that. That's all nothing. You just simply give up family, children, everything. You enter into the monastery and seek enlightenment. It's your personal quest. That's everything. It's the sole focus of your life. So the Theravadins are really trying to keep to the Buddha's original teaching and practice as found in the earliest writings, and Theravada therefore emphasizes the individual's effort towards nirvana. You don't need the Buddha. There's already been a Buddha. So forget about the Buddha. You're on your personal quest. You, with the help of a teacher, of course, there are teachers, are on your quest and your path towards enlightenment. You have to do it. There's no God who's going to help you. There's nothing like that. It's a truly personal journey, and only monks can achieve salvation. And of course, there are nuns. There are the female monks, but they, of course, have to be reincarnated as male monks in order to achieve salvation. So that's a little wrinkle. There's something about women with religions, always putting them down. But that's just the way it is, in Buddhism. You have to return as a male in order. You can only achieve true enlightenment by becoming a male. So in Theravada countries, it's like Thailand, it's not unusual for people to spend, for Buddhist believers, to spend at least part of their life in a monastery, even if they have a normal life that they lead, a job. They might spend some time in a monastery, at least to keep that connection with what's the original goal, the original practice. So the focus is not so much on the Buddha or becoming Buddha or even worshiping Buddha, but it's on your personal journey. Although, in Theravada temples, you will have statues of the Buddha and stuff like that, but these are means to an end. These are things that you can meditate on, the goal that you're going towards, which is enlightenment. Okay? So the purpose of your goal is to become fully enlightened, or at least as enlightened as you can be in this existence, which is ahat, which comes from arhati in Sanskrit, which means to be a worthy. So a worthy one. And that's the name for someone who has reached enlightenment but won't really get there until after death. After death. And when you become an arhat, you apparently get all sorts of supernatural powers. Like, as I said, you know everything. You can fly through the air like Superman, apparently. But anyway, you get all sorts of supernatural abilities when you become an arhat. Another name for Theravada that you will come across is Hinayana, the lesser or inferior vehicle. Excuse me. And you have to kind of avoid this name. I'm giving it to you because it's still out there, and you'll encounter it a lot, I think. But really, the name Hinayana was developed by the Mahayana opponents of Theravada. It's the name they gave to Theravada. You know, they were the great vehicle, Mahayana, and Theravada was the lesser or the inferior vehicle, Hinayana. So it's discouraged to use that as the general title of Theravada. Theravadins don't necessarily like it. And the greater vehicle comes from a parable, the parable of the burning house. Oh, here it is. The parable of the burning house, where it's a Buddhist story describing what's going on in Buddhist teaching, is that, the world is like a house that's on fire, and, a father and his children are in this burning house. So kind of like symbolic of the world of suffering and craving and whatever, is the house on fire, and we are in this house on fire. We want to get out of this house on fire. So the father, instead of calling the fire department, decides to get a bunch of carts to carry his children out of the house. Why carts? I don't know. Anyways, I guess call 911, Mr. Sullivan. You know what I'm saying? Hello, fire. Anyways, and one cart is really big, one cart's really small, and Hinayana, and this is, I guess, told from a Mahayanist perspective, because Hinayana is kind of symbolized by the small cart. It's the small vehicle that the kids kind of cram themselves into, which helps them get out of the burning house. But eventually, you want to get into the bigger cart, okay, that the father has, which is the greater vehicle. So Hinayana, if you have to practice Buddhism from a Mahayanist perspective, okay, then you can do Theravada. But it's really a preliminary step to the true wisdom that you'll find in Mahayana, the greater vehicle. Mahayana, yes. Mahayana appears later, as you might expect, since Theravada is the oldest of the lineages. Mahayana appears later in the 100s BC to 100 AD, in which the Mahasanghika groups develop into this thing called Mahayana. As I already told you, it's the majority of Buddhism, 60%, and I showed you which countries it's mainly associated with. The Mahayanas were open to doctrinal innovation. Was known for being open to doctrinal development. And also Mahayana was known for being socially extroverted, by which we mean that Mahayana was open to welcoming lay people, non-monks, into their practices. Also incorporating popular religious devotions from local cultures and things, that just reinterpreting them in a Buddhist way. So, local gods and goddesses could be brought in, into the Buddhist religion. So you see that a lot of Buddhist statuary, which, are what were Hindu gods and goddesses or local spirits and things. And not that Buddhism necessarily believes in these things or in these gods and goddesses, but they're helpful. If they're helpful to leading people to understanding the Dharma and how to reach enlightenment, then they can be useful. Whereas Theravada, in contrast, not so much. I mean, as I said, people for places like Thailand will enter into the monastery for a period of time, part of their life, but they don't stay there necessarily. And usually the disciples, the general public, are not really welcomed into the monastery. It's not that they're mean about it or whatever, but it's not really the place for them because they haven't been ordained into the monastic life. Whereas Mahayana is much more welcoming. It wanted to get people, it's like, come one, come all, come to the Dharma. They wanted to promote the Dharma to as many people as possible. Whereas Theravada seems to keep it more, it's inside the building of the monastery with the monks who are focused on it. We don't have any Mahayanist literature prior to the AD, so the Anno Domini period, yet Mahayana claims to be the true teaching of the Buddha. Well, how do you explain that when you don't have any evidence for it until several hundred years later? And the Mahayana groups have to come up with different explanations. One explanation that you'll find, for example, in Zen Buddhism, which originated in Japan, is to say, well, it was there, but, it was really a special wordless transmission that by its nature couldn't really have a literary written witness. Almost like a virus, it was the Mahayana teachings are kind of like passed on by like a virus, like sneezing. One monk sneezed on the other in a way and passed on the teachings of the Mahayana interpretation of the Dharma. Or you might think of it like osmosis, with water, where things can come through the how things enter into the wall of a cell or something through osmosis. So the teaching, they kind of just absorbed our teaching without having to say it actually. And so it was a wordless transmission in that way. And then eventually it got written down, but it was always there. Okay. That's a story that you can tell yourselves. That's all right. Theravadins might disagree with that. But anyways, the basic teaching of Mahayana is focused on the compassion, and this is especially centralized in the figure of the Bodhisattva. Compassion for all sentient beings, and what your job is to seek Buddhahood, to seek full enlightenment and nirvana, with the purpose of bringing it to others. You kind of delay, a bodhisattva will delay his own full entrance into nirvana in order to help other beings become free too, out of compassion. And this is called the Great Compassion. In the case of Theravada, because it's so personally focused, you're so focused on your own personal getting to nirvana in the traditional way, they call that the small compassion. So you see there's like a lot of back and forth, a little tit and tat, maybe nastiness you could say shown between the two groups, especially the Mahayanists kind of looking down in the Theravada way. That's small compassion. That's small potatoes. We're interested in the great compassion, this altruism of the person who will become the bodhisattva in order to bring others to enlightenment. Mahayana does accept the basic writings of the Theravada school, the Tipitaka, but Mahayana also uses numerous other texts, which may be actually preferred to the older ones as further developments of the Buddha's teaching. Okay, the Tipitaka might just be seen as provisional. These are the early, actually, they kind of look at it like these are the teachings for the stupid people. These are for the simple people. The Tipitaka is for the simpletons. But then in our writings, we develop them out and show you what really it means and how you should live the Dharma. For Mahayana Buddhism, nirvana is intended for all mankind. And because of that, anything that pushes someone forward towards nirvana is useful. And that's why Mahayana oftentimes makes concessions to popular piety and devotion and accommodates, cultural rituals that might not be Buddhist, but they bring them into Buddhism. The Bodhisattva Okay. You have that definition of bodhisattva. Bodhi, we know, means enlightened. It comes from the Sanskrit word for to be awake, also enlightened. And sattva means a being. So literally an enlightened being, an awoken being is a bodhisattva. Someone who has actually achieved Buddhahood, enlightenment, full enlightenment, but does that, makes a vow that if I do reach this, I'm doing it for the sake of others, to bring others to enlightenment as well. And you do this throughout your subsequent reincarnations, okay? So the bodhisattva is not so much a teacher as a savior figure. You can expect help from the bodhisattva. You can reach out and pray to the bodhisattva, even worship in some cases the bodhisattva. Not just in your journey to nirvana, but also for help in your daily life. A major belief, I should say, of both Theravada and Mahayana, I placed it here with Mahayana, but I think Theravadins would also agree with this idea, is the idea of shunyata, or emptiness. Okay, but you see this a lot with Mahayana Buddhism. And it's really an extension of the Buddha's idea of dependent arising, that things arise into existence and go out of existence. But there's really, because of this, there's really no substantial foundation in those things, because they exist. They don't exist forever. If they did, then they'd have a foundation. But since they don't have one, they exist and then they can go out of existence, and they're not being anymore. So it's kind of an extension of that idea. For Mahayana Buddhism, emptiness means that all things are empty of meaning. You know, our minds have a powerful tendency to attach reality value to objects, but there really is not a reality value there. With shunyata, all things are empty of meaning and reality, and so any designation is essentially arbitrary. This applies even to the Dharma. This is why they can say that the Buddha's teachings are provisional, that even ultimately the Dharma of the Buddha is shunyata, is empty. Why do we regard these things as existent? Because the unenlightened mind is easily trapped in this system of dualities, good and bad, good and evil, of matter and non-matter, antimatter, of these various dualities, male, female, rather than recognizing that they really aren't with foundation. But then, if this is the case, how can you learn anything at all? I mean, even the Dharma itself is without foundation. How can the Dharma be useful to even lead you to enlightenment, I guess, in a way, because you're kind of like undercutting the whole thing. You're taking the whole foundation out from underneath it. And to do that, you have this idea of expedient means, or what's also called skillful means. Actually, let me see. See how much of it I can get through. I'm just debating amongst myself. All right, which is the use of various conceptual strategies to lead someone on the path to enlightenment. So basically, whatever gets you there, whatever gets you to enlightenment is useful. Okay? And it could be anything. If you want to believe in gods, believe in gods. And if that's going to get you to enlightenment, then that's going to get you to enlightenment. If you want to follow the Theravada way, follow that. That's the preliminary way. Okay, do that. You think it's meditation, then meditation. All right? Whatever is a means to bring you to nirvana, or help you understand the Dharma, is useful then. So skillful, you could also say useful means, but traditionally it's translated as expedient means. And basically it's an adaptation of the Buddhist teaching to the level of the audience's existing attainment. We now can understand Buddhist teaching in a certain way, but people 2,000 years ago could not in their context. They had a different mindset, they spoke different languages, had very different cultures. And even now, there are very different cultures and languages, and people think different ways in the world. So not everyone can be brought to the Dharma in the same way and on the same level. So you have to adapt the Dharma to those people. And the Buddha's teaching is provisional in that sense for bringing people to enlightenment. His teachings therefore may vary. What's appropriate to one time and place may not be appropriate to another time and place. And so Mahayana uses this idea of expedient means to justify innovations in doctrine. And so they actually view the Buddha's earlier teachings, earlier Dharma, as limited and actually restricted to the potential of his early followers, who were simple people in their minds. They were simpletons. And the Buddha had to talk to them that way in the 500s BC. But now we know better in a way, you know. So what do? You can change the teaching or the practice when it seems to benefit beings, when it seems to warrant it. But you're doing it out of compassion. So your intention is compassion. It's for bringing people to enlightenment. And bodhisattvas have this license to do it, to even break precepts and commit acts which would otherwise draw, say, moral censure, might be considered wrong normally. But if they're doing it out of compassion to lead to nirvana or enlightenment, then it's okay. That's a difficult one for me, because that seems to open the door to a lot of manipulation, or a lot of devilry, if you want, you know. But for example, there's an example of this is a story of Captain Great Compassion. Like a superhero. Captain America, Captain Great Compassion, okay? And it's a story that's told in a Mahayanist text, to explain this idea of expedient means. Now, one of the Pancha Shilas, is to not harm any living being, which generally means don't kill someone, don't commit murder, you know, whatever. But the Bodhisattva can, in some cases, actually kill people. And I don't mean like in war or whatever like that, but if the conditions are right and if it's done out of compassion, then you can't actually harm a living being. You can't actually do what appears to break that essential vow or rule of the community. And so the story of, you know, the Captain Great Compassion. It's a story of a captain of a ship who finds out that there's this evil man, says it's a thief, but it's an evil man who boards a boat with like 500 other people, or a few hundred other people. And this evil guy wants to rob them all of their stuff, but to do that, he's going to have to kill them all. Okay? And so the captain, whose name is Great Compassion, who's the Buddha, in a way, finds out about this guy's plan in a dream somehow. He finds out that this guy's going to kill him. And so the Buddha, or Captain Great Compassion, has to decide what to do about this. And so he thinks, he's like, well, you know, if he does this man does this, he will go into one of the great hells. You know, he'll burn in hell for thousands and thousands of years. He won't go to enlightenment, so I don't want that to happen. He'll be suffering. But if, for example, the people find out, if I could go and tell everybody, hey, this guy had this plan to kill us all and steal our stuff, well, they might turn on the thief, this evil man, and kill him. And then that will send them all to a hell where they'll suffer for thousands and thousands of years. Or I could even kill him. I could just kill him so that he doesn't do it. But then I might go to a hell for thousands and thousands of years. So these are his choices. It doesn't seem, well, what can I do? Well, he still decides the best way to do him is to kill him, to end his life so he can't kill all these other people, but to do it with great compassion. You're not doing it because you want to murder him, but you're doing violence to this guy, this evil guy, so that he won't commit an evil action that will send him to hell and to enlightenment. And the people won't find out and kill this guy and send them to hell and not to enlightenment. But I'm also doing this action out of compassion for all those people, which is a great meritorious action. So I'm not going to go to hell. I can go to enlightenment. And so he takes a spear and he stabs the guy. So he commits murder. We could say defensive murder in a way. But that's an explanation of how expedient means or skillful means can be used. You're using skillful means to, it's kind of an allegory of using the Dharma in a skillful way, in ways that might be deceitful and deceptive, like telling people, like, yeah, there's a God and there's an afterlife when you really don't think there is one. But it gives people hope. It'll make them pray and say their mantras and go to the temple. Are you lying to them? Yeah, because you don't believe it's true. You know it's untrue. But that's expedient means. Now, okay. All right. So, anyways, where this becomes a problem is when you get into some of the sexual yoga and stuff like that that's used in some forms of Buddhism, like Tibetan Buddhism. And you have a guru or a teacher who says, hey, I want you to sleep with me because that will help you on the road to enlightenment. And then tries to, which could be a form of rape. And some Buddhists, have said, yeah, I was raped by a teacher, but it's but it's defended by expedient means. They say, yeah, but I'm just using this practice, which normally you shouldn't do. Normally a teacher should not have sex with his student, but I'm doing it because it will bring you closer to enlightenment. We're using the sexual faculty or the pleasure to lead the person on. And there's some Buddhists who buy that argument because and they also believe if the guru is an enlightened being, a bodhisattva, he can't do anything wrong. He's completely enlightened. He doesn't see things the way you see things. So you're seeing things from maybe a narrow perspective, where the bodhisattva is seeing things from a broader perspective. But, I was reading a talk by the Dalai Lama addressing kind of these issues of what do you do with a guru who's maybe trying to use expedient means to justify what really is not good behavior, monks behaving badly. He said, well, you have to test the guru. And one of the tests is ask him if he can fly through the air. Because if he can fly through the air, then he really is an enlightened being and, you're sure you're doing the right thing. Okay, Dalai Lama. I'm not sure that leads me along to agreeing with that, but anyways. So this is an interesting teaching of Buddhism, but it does maybe open the door to abuse in some cases. Follow through in a certain way. Okay, I'll see you on Thursday. God bless you all.